Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Fosnot, Watershed Education Network Director. In honor of our 20th anniversary, Watershed Education Network is thrilled to share one of our past projects with you. And this one, you'll find some familiar faces, Frances Wigan, Wendy Reidenauer, and other naturalists that you know around Missoula and Western Montana. We also want to give a huge shout out to Ron Scholl, our filmmaker. Created in 2004, Refuge, Urban Wetlands of Missoula, explores the natural classroom of Missoula's Cattail Corner and Bancroft Pond. This educational video incorporates interviews with local scientists arranged in 3 segments. Part 1 covers wetland functions, hydrology, hydric soil, and plants. Part 2 covers aquatic macroinvertebrates, amphibians, and reptiles. Part 3 covers birds, mammals, threats to wetlands, and future stewards. We hope you enjoy this series, and we hope to see you at the creek or the wetland in the near future. Thank you.
There's something wet, born from rain and snow, that starts out high and then begins to flow. Hang on, we'll see where this water goes. On its voyage to the river, water turns to song in Missoula's urban wetlands. Missoula benefits from 2 low spots of high interest: Bancroft Pond and Cattail Corner. Bancroft Pond is excavated and partly wooded, several acres large. Cattail Corner is open and half the size. Both wetlands are closely bounded by the city of Missoula. Nevertheless, the full spectrum of ecological life finds refuge in our urban wetlands.
There are lots of different kinds of wetlands, and the wetland that we have here is sort of like an inland marsh, okay? And you can see all the cattails typically growing in a wetland marsh. So how about you tell everybody about that, okay? And you can tell everybody that all wetlands, do you remember the 3 things they do? They provide habitat, which is food, water, and shelter. They also filter out pollution, and they soak up a lot of the rainwater. Okay. Can you guys remember that?
Yeah, it's habitat, rain, and pollution. Okay.
Right. Okay. I'm Wendy Reidenauer from the Montana Natural History Center, and I'm a plant and wetlands ecologist. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what a wetland is. In other words, what's the definition of a wetland? Wetlands require the presence of 3 different things in order to be considered wetlands. They need to have a wetland soil, wetland plants, and the presence of water, or hydrology. Wetlands hold a lot of the water that runs off of the ground, called runoff, stormwater runoff, after a rainstorm or when the snow is melting. And this is important because if we didn't have wetlands, all of that runoff would rush pretty much immediately into rivers and streams, causing really large-scale flooding events. Now, floods are important, but we don't want a really big flood every time it floods. So wetlands are holding this water, keeping it there for a while. They're also helping to control pollution that's in the runoff, things like fertilizer and pesticides that come from residential settings or golf courses and things like oil and gasoline and other toxics that come off of parking lots like we have right over there. And these things have a chance then to settle out in the wetland as they sit there in the water, and some of the plants in the wetland actually uptake these materials, and some of them can even be broken down or metabolized by the plants. So the water then running off into the stream or the river after it passes through the wetland is cleaner, and wetlands will hold water well into the dry part of the year in August, so that they can slowly continue to release water even when there is no rainfall. Another really good thing. And then one of the most important things about wetlands is that they're fantastic habitat. About 80% of our North American animals have to use wetlands at some part of their life cycle. Wetlands only make up about 1% of our land area, so they're extremely important places. This is a great little urban wetland, and it provides these functions for the most part. So there are lots and lots of different types of wetlands, and this one is an inland marsh. It's dominated by herbaceous vegetation. In other words, we don't have a lot of shrubs, and we certainly don't have trees, so it's not a forested wetland. It's saturated by water and in fact inundated. A large portion of it is actually inundated by water the entire year, and certainly through the entire growing season. There's actually a lot of diversity mixed in with the cattails, especially along the edges. A lot of sedges and rushes and other forbs. Bancroft Pond is a very similar habitat in that it's an isolated urban wetland. Just the fact that this area has been excavated out as a pond as opposed to a natural wetland that would have more of a gradation from imponded to saturated, you're just not going to get as much variety in a lot of the herbaceous plant species.
Hi, my name is Chris, and here we are at Bancroft Ponds in Missoula, and you can see the nice wetland here behind us with the cattails and the blackbirds, and there's ducks. But, you know, all of this stuff that we can see at the surface is beautiful, but I'm a geologist, so I'm really interested in what happens underneath the surface, underground. How does this wetland work in terms of how does it store water for us? What does it do for us? Well, this is where water comes into the wetland. This is Paddy Creek. You can see that it's kind of an engineered creek right here. It comes out of Paddy Canyon as a natural creek, but when it flows through neighborhoods, past houses, and underneath roads, it ends up being a little bit more engineered. So it's a bit of a ditch while it comes into Bancroft wetlands. Once this water flows into the wetland, where does it go? Well, some of it soaks into the ground, and it enters what we call the groundwater. In other words, it goes down to the water table, and it flows through soil and gravel through the Missoula Valley, and eventually it ends up in the Bitterroot River. And Paddy Creek eventually ends up in the Bitterroot River too. It flows year-round, and so the wetland stays wet year-round. Of course, in the springtime, we tend to get more water, like there is now. There's a fair amount of water coming in. And later on in the summer, there will be less water, and the water level in the wetland will go down a little bit, but still, there's water in the wetland year-round. This wetland that we're looking at is a beautiful wetland and great habitat for birds, but it fulfills another function too. Think about when it rains really hard, or think about when the snow melts. Where does all that water go? It goes into those drains that you see in the street. You might ask the question, well, where does that water go? Where does it end up? In Missoula, here's one place where it ends up. If you live in the South Hills, your storm water comes out right here. And it comes out into the Bancroft ponds. And so the ponds do sort of double duty for us. These wetlands store and purify the stormwater runoff by slowing the water down so the sediment has a chance to fall out of the water. And the vegetation and the sediment that's left in the wetlands then filters any of the additional pollutants that might happen to be in that stormwater runoff. So Paddy Creek which is the creek that comes out of Patty Canyon, comes into the wetland, it slows down and spreads out in the wetland, and then it comes out the other side, again as a stream. So we can see that there's a lot of water at the surface, but that's not the only place where water flows. Water is also flowing underground. In fact, the wetland is acting like a giant sponge. So what does this sponge, or what does this wetland do for us? Well, a couple of things. First of all, it does slow down floodwater. So imagine if we have a big flood, we've got lots and lots of water coming into the wetland. The wetland slows all that water down, and so it spreads the flood out, and it comes out more slowly on the other end, so it helps decrease flooding. The other thing that it does is that it filters the water that comes into it. So if we have dirty water, say from runoff from the streets, if we've got, dirt in yards and sand in driveways that are getting hosed down into those drains that you see in the streets, all of that comes out at the top of this wetland, and it flows through this wetland. So when this dirty storm water comes into our wetland, which is our sponge, remember, the sponge filters all that dirty, gunky stuff out. And so we're left with cleaner water coming out the other end. So look at the dirty water going in and this much cleaner water coming out. And so all of that sand and sediment and other pollutants are held within the wetland, within the sponge. Okay, so the wetland acts like a filter. So just to review, what do wetlands do for us? They store floodwaters, they filter out pollutants, and the other thing they do is they recharge the water table. That water then replenishes streams further downhill.
A wetland soil has a special name. It's called a hydric soil. So the other one of you is going to tell everybody, see these little red lines where the roots were in the soil?
Okay.
You can tell this is a wetland or hydric soil because these little red areas around the roots are where the roots pumped oxygen out into the soil.
Okay, what is it called again?
A hydric soil.
Soil.
Hydric relating to water, hydrology.
When soils become saturated with water, oxygen is moved out of the soil. When there's no more oxygen in the soil, we call that an anaerobic condition, lack of oxygen. When this happens, there's a chemical reaction that occurs in the soil that leaves behind specific color characteristics that we can see. The chemistry behind this would be kind of comparing a piece of iron machinery gets wet, and when it dries, rust forms on it. Rust is iron oxide. Soils, most soils, have a lot of iron in the soil profile, and it's in the form of iron oxide, and it's kind of just spread around the soil. You can't really see any spots of rust in the soil. When the groundwater comes up and saturates near the surface, where you have a lot of microorganisms going, the oxygen is removed, both from the water pushing the air out and from the microorganisms using that air to breathe. When all of the oxygen is gone, you have an anaerobic condition. The iron in the soil is reduced. It goes from an oxidized state to a reduced state. And in this reduced state, iron is mobile. It's like dissolved in the soil. So you've got these iron atoms floating around in this soil water. The water table drops, or the ponding water on top goes down or runs off, or the floodwaters recede. Air comes back into the soil profile. As it starts to work its way in, the oxygen in that air attracts those iron atoms that are floating around, and it forms little rust spots in the soil. So what this means is, because the soils leave behind these color characteristics, you can go out in August and dig a hole in an area and determine if that soil is ever saturated at some time during the year. That cycle of the water going down eventually and then coming back up and staying that way actually strips all the iron out of that soil profile and leaves behind a gleyed soil color. And a gleyed soil color would be like gray, maybe a bluish or a greenish gray. When we talk about the different soil colors, Soil scientists have even come up with their own coloring book. When we start talking about glade soils now, we're talking about colors that look like this. I have some samples here of some different types of soils. Let's start with the upland soils. This is a grassland soil. It has a darker colored surface. Grassland soils have a darker colored surface because they have more organic matter in the surface layer, and this is because most of the roots in a grass plant are near the surface. This particular soil is called Scoby clay loam and is our state soil. Probably didn't know that states have their own state soil, like the state tree and the state bird. Every state has a state soil. Let's look at some hydric soils, some wetland soils. Notice the colors down here. I guess with my eyes, I'm kind of looking at that as being kind of a gray with a little bit, maybe a green tint to it. This particular soil formed in an old, small glacial lake. On top of this silt down here, we have some organic layers. A lot of people think about peat bogs. Those are organic soils. This is like a peat bog. This is just decomposed organic matter, the types of vegetation that would grow in a wetland. This particular soil is another organic soil, except it's more than 6 feet deep before we'd hit the silts. These things started out as a pond, deep water, and as sediment came in, there's a little bit of soil, mineral soil in here, but you had this emergent vegetation growing, dying, not completely decomposing, but building up from the bottom up, these layers of peat. And pretty soon, it's just a nice big peat bog that might have some water on the surface in the spring of the year, but then it goes down. This is a mineral wetland soil, all mineral soil material above it as compared to the organic material in these. And in here, you could, the lower part, you can see more of the gray colors. This is where the soil stays saturated for longer periods in the year. As you come up towards the surface, you start to see more of these reddish brown spots. Those are those rust spots I was talking about earlier. Where the groundwater table would come up in the spring, it would stay up here maybe for 2-3 weeks, maybe a month, and then the groundwater starts to drop down, but it sits at this level for a longer period, maybe even throughout the growing season. The iron that formed the rust spots up here has been stripped out, removed, leached down out in this zone. The Bancroft ponds here are what we call artificial wetlands. These areas were diked up to block the water to create these wetlands. Natural wetland soils, hydric soils, in nature take many years to form those glade colors and the rust spots in them. This sample here, you can see it's still really wet. I dug it out of that flat area just behind, in front of me over here, and we don't see the reddish brown rust spots in here. The soil colors are just kind of a dark brown. I suspect part of the reason we don't see them here, besides the fact that this soil hasn't been through the saturation cycles for dozens and dozens of years, is that it's still relatively cold and a little too wet. The formation of these rust spots in the soil is a biochemical reaction. It needs the microbial part of it to occur along with the chemical reaction. And it's still too cold for those microorganisms to completely take the oxygen out of here to develop that anaerobic condition where the iron would become reduced and then float around in the soil. As the water level in these ponds go down and more air comes back into this soil, we should start to see some rust spots develop in here. You can usually tell an artificial wetland soil from a natural wetland soil by the matrix color of the soil staying this brown color, but still developing rust spots in it. If this was a natural hydric soil, this zone through here wouldn't be this dark brown color. It would be a light grayish brown color, maybe even a gray color. The organic matter in this soil is quite high. You can tell by the dark color on the surface. It's usually difficult to see those rust spots in a zone that has high organic matter in it. Over time, this area here, with these artificial wetlands, will develop those color patterns. This particular soil here will probably start to develop more rust modeling down here. I don't know how long it might take. There's still a lot of organic matter in here, and I still kind of think if we let this dry out completely, you'd start to see some faint rust spots in that soil. This is called texture by feel. Of course, we could send this sample into a lab. First thing we're going to try to estimate is the amount of clay that it has in it. When you have it into about the Play-Doh consistency, you take it between your thumb and your index finger and see if you can push it up like this, make a ribbon that stands up. If it stands up, you know you got a fair amount of clay in it. You always have to remember that most all soils have some sand, silt, and clay in them. So this sample here doesn't have much clay in it. We can't make a ribbon, but it's holding together. We know it's got some clay in it. So we're going to say that this particular soil has 15% clay. And the way we analyze for sand is you take a little bit of it and you pour water over it and rub it really good. Try to kind of wash it down. So now you can start to feel the sand. It's fine sand. We actually separate sand into very fine sand, medium sand, coarse sand, and very coarse sand. So this particular soil, I would estimate to have in the neighborhood of probably 40 to 50% sand. Let's call it 45% sand, 15% clay. That adds up to 60. So the remainder, 40%, is silt. We can take this textural triangle here, and we say we have about 15% clay, so we come up the clay side between the 10 and the 20, and we come over, and we said 45% sand, so we come up, and where those intersect, that's what we're at. So this is a loam. So that's all soil by texture, or soil texture by feel. So soil texture is real important. We have a nice loamy soil here. Look at the structure in there, the high organic matter, this nice like crumb structure. Structure is how the soil particles are clumped together. And this nice crumb structure, we call it granular, allows air and water to move down into the soil to get down to where most of the roots are. Soil has a tremendous capacity to filter out pollutants in the environment. It's nature's filter is what it is. A well-functioning wetland is able to trap pollutants, heavy metals included. If you have runoff into a wetland area and you have good turnover of organic material in the processes that occur in wetlands, those pollutants can actually be trapped in the soil itself and held there. The organic matter in soils and the clay in soils ties up a lot of the pollutants that might enter a wetland. In urban wetlands where you have a lot of use and a lot of people walking around the wetlands to look at the vegetation and enjoy the animals and the birds, you could get some soil compaction. When soils are moist or wet, they're more easily compacted than when they are dry, and generally soils around the edges of wetlands are wet. On the other side of the ponds over here, where people walk down to feed the ducks all the time, those soils would be highly compacted.
It's really important to have a lot of plants in any given area because they produce food.
Okay.
Right? They're the base of the food web. Without plants, none of us would be here.
Okay. So
good. Wetland plants are called hydrophytic vegetation, and they are plants that are either obligate, in other words, they absolutely have to grow in wetlands and waterlogged soil, or they tend to do best in wetland soil. So hydrophytic vegetation, these plants, like the cattails in back of us, are plants that are found predominantly on wetter sites, and we need a predominance of them in order for the area to be considered a wetland. Plants play many, many roles in a wetland. They stabilize the soil with their roots, and their root systems do prevent erosion to a certain extent. Plants also uptake a lot of the nutrient pollution, in other words, a lot of excessive fertilizer that's running off of golf courses and residential lawns, things like that. So they'll uptake this, they'll uptake and metabolize some of the other pollutants, even breaking them down. Plants do provide habitat value as well, food for animals. Countless species produce berries and seeds that birds and other animals eat, and of course a lot of herbivores graze in wetlands. So many roles as our primary producers. The predominant vegetation here is the cattails, Typha latifolia. Even though they are forming a monoculture out here, they do provide some really important habitat. These red-winged blackbirds not only eat parts of the cattail, they build their nests down low in these cattail stems, so it's providing them excellent cover. Cattails also provide really important habitat for muskrats, and in fact there is a muskrat home in this wetland, and they make their homes out of cattail stems, just big piles of cattail stems with underwater entrances. And muskrats even eat cattails. Cattails also had a lot of Native American uses. They were used as a food source. The inner part of the root could be eaten raw. They roasted them. They could also be ground into a flour. They could weave mats out of the leaves, the nice flat leaves, and the fluff of the seeds was used as baby ciphers. So the actual cattail structure that this plant is named for is the seeds of the plant. They have tiny little seeds attached to this fluff that helps them disperse away by wind and water from the parent plants. Wow. One plant certainly produces a lot of seeds. Cattails do a really interesting thing. They actually have big air spaces in their roots called parenchyma, and a lot of wetland plants do have parenchyma because their roots are underwater and they need oxygen in order to survive. So a lot of wetland plants actually pump oxygen down into their roots, into these spaces. And cattails and other wetland vegetation often release oxygen then out of their roots into the soil. Often, if you crack open a wetland soil sample, you'll see red lines that are called oxidized rhizospheres, and these are simply the areas surrounding a root where the oxygen released by the root into the soil has caused any iron in the soil to oxidize, and so you get that reddish color. And again, this is very, very commonly found in a wetland soil. There is some experimental evidence that cattails are actually supplying enough oxygen in the soil that they're actually facilitating or helping other plant species, such as forget-me-nots and willows. These are two native plant species that at least experimentally seem to be benefiting from the oxygen supplied by cattails. There are other obligate wetland plant species out here. Obligate meaning they absolutely need this saturated soil to live. There are a lot of sedges and rushes, and they are grass-like plants, but they're not grasses. Sedges have edges and rushes around. This is a rush, and this is the common rush, also called soft rush, Juncus effusus, and this is its flowering structure right here. So this is last year's flowering structure, and even though it looks like a grass, it's not. It's a grass-like plant. Rushes are round, so these are nice round stems. This is a classic sedge clump, and most sedges are obligate wetland species. They absolutely need to be in the water or in saturated soil. And these leaves are quite different from the rush leaves we saw earlier because sedges have edges. And this sedge will bloom later in the summer. There aren't any of last year's blooms, unfortunately, but they're really unique in that they have a male tassel, the staminate tassel, above the pistillate or female flower. All of these obligate wetland plants are providing some function, at least, in some uptake of pollution. Some of that is actually being biochemically broken down. And in addition to that, again, the surface runoff is slowing down when it's hitting these stems and when it's sitting here imponded. Although algae is photosynthetic, it's not technically a plant. It's in the kingdom Protista, so it's not a plant or an animal. And the predominant algae species that lives in this pond is Spirogyra, and it's named for its spiral-shaped chloroplast, and that's what actually holds the chlorophyll and does the photosynthesis. And you see this spiral-shaped chloroplast when you're looking at this under a microscope. Quite beautiful. Duckweed is a tiny little flowering plant, and it has these little floating leaves. Their flowers are almost impossible to see. They're so small. Now, the interesting thing about duckweed is that it actually does get caught on the feet of waterfowl, the feet and feathers of waterfowl, and is transported from pond to pond, wetland to wetland, so that it's really all over the place. We have a woods rose here, a wild rose, and you can still see the rose hips, the red rose hips, which are the fruit from last fall. They've actually overwintered, and these rose hips are an excellent food source. Mammals, and that includes people, and birds do love to eat them, and they're very high in vitamins, including vitamin C. These plants not only provide a good food source, but there are a number of bird species, such as goldfinches, that apparently even nest in them. Another thing I wanted to point out here is the willow, and this is a salix species, but willow is very, very flexible, which helps it survive floods. That's because it bends, it doesn't break, and the network of roots in the soil holds it in, stabilizes stream banks, and in the bark of the willow is salicylic acid, which is the same chemical compound found in aspirin. Behind us are some cottonwood trees, and these are a wonderful riparian species. It's the black cottonwood, Populus trichocarpa, and cottonwoods are fantastic in terms of habitat. They provide not only great nest cavity sites for woodpeckers and the other songbirds that use old woodpecker nest cavities, but also I've seen lots of different species of birds foraging for insect and insect larval food in the bark. And cottonwoods are also a very important riparian species because, again, they help stabilize the stream bank. They have a really interesting life cycle in that in order for the seeds to germinate and then establish, they actually need open areas. So that's often a sand or a gravel bar that's been exposed by a flooding event. So we do need these floods. They're regular disturbances that are important parts of wetland and riparian systems. So they need lots of moisture and lots of sunlight. They're very shade intolerant. And they're little teeny weeny seeds that float off on the water and in the air on their cotton. That's how they get their name, the fluffy cottony seeds. When we do a lot of things that control flooding, that prevent flooding, then basically the cottonwoods are no longer able to establish. So you have mature cottonwoods in some areas with no juveniles that will eventually replace them. And also, they really are poor competitors because they're so shade intolerant. And invasive species have shaded them out in